Good afternoon everyone and welcome to the Melbourne Writers Festival. My name is Benjamin Law. I'd like to start today by acknowledging that we're gathered here in Kulin Nation. The Wurundjeri and Bunurong people are the first peoples of this area and we pay respects to their elders and elders across Victoria, past and present. Some fun housekeeping before we start. Get out your mobile phone, check that it's on silent, but don't turn them off completely. We prefer you leave them on silent because then you can post about this event via social media. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or using the hashtag MWF15. Our guest today is known by a couple of names. Young readers, of course, know him best as Lemony Snicket, the author of the beloved, ghastly, irredeemably diabolical international best-selling books, a series of unfortunate events which have sold over 60 million copies worldwide and was adapted into a feature film. However, under his real name, he's known for his adult novels and books, including The Basic 8, Watch Your Mouth, Adverbs, and his collaborations with the renowned illustrator Myra Kalman, including Why We Broke Up. His latest novel is We Are Pirates, a genre-bending adventure on the high seas of modern-day San Francisco, and it's one of the most outrageously, entertainingly deranged books you'll read this year. However, in amongst all the mayhem, it asks some fundamental questions about the price of escape, the bonds between families, and most importantly, the ethics of being a goddamn mother-flippin' teenage pirate. Please join me in welcoming to the Melbourne Writers Festival, Daniel Handler.
Mother flipping, I've never heard that
Mother
expression.
flipping, that's just, the child-friendly version there. Daniel Handler, let's start with pirates, or at least let's start with the teenager who may or may not become a pirate in your book, 14-year-old Gwen. For those of us who haven't read the book, tell us a bit about Gwen. What kind of a girl is she? What's going on in her life and mind when we meet her in your book?
She's angry. She's 14 and she is angry.
What's she angry about?
Well, what isn't she angry about would probably be a question that would get a shorter answer. The novel is dedicated to my sister, who was also angry when she was 14.
You remember that time well?
Very well. I'd never seen anyone so angry. She speaks of it kind of nostalgically now. She's older. But I would watch her be angry. I was older than she was. I still am. And I would say to myself, I'd never seen anyone so angry. And then I would kind of walk around the world and I would realize that that's not really what I meant. What I meant was that I'd never seen someone who was female who was that angry. And that really struck me when I was young. And it continues to strike me. And I think that often young women are angry, and that their anger is labeled as a symptom of the age. Hello.
Farewell.
Sorry, no, there's many fascinating objects to see. Allow me to recommend Laurie Penny. So oftentimes when young women are angry, it's labeled as kind of a symptom of adolescence. And I always saw it as kind of a rational reaction to the expectations that are placed on young women. I can't imagine that it's that different in Australia than it is in the United States, that young women are told basically simultaneously that they can do everything and that they can do nothing. And they often get angry. And then we say, it's so adorable that you're angry at this age.
Well, something you just said before is that you realised that you hadn't seen specifically females of that age angry. Did you think that, were you more exposed to a male type of anger and therefore it was surprising seeing that?
Well, I think if you walk the streets in a traffic jam, you'll see many men who are as angry as anything you've seen. I think that it was more striking to me because it was coming from the gender that is not encouraged to be angry under basically any circumstances. And so some of the books started there with that kind of anger, that kind of ferocity that I saw in my sister and in young women. And so Gwen is very angry, perhaps justifiably or perhaps in ways that we don't understand, but she feels trapped in her situation. She's an adolescent girl and she'd like to be anywhere other than where she is. And so she eventually cooks up a plan to take to the high seas.
Now, We Are Pirates splits between Gwen and the other main character of the book, which is her father, Phil. He's facing his own suite of problems and predicaments. Tell us about Phil and what he's facing.
He's a father. He's not as successful in business as he would like to be. and he fancies himself kind of rebellion and a rogue. I can't imagine that this is an unfamiliar archetype here in Australia either, where there's a man who feels entitled to even more riches and delights that seem to have popped into his lap.
Oh, that'd be replaced.
Yeah. At my request, I might add. I just didn't like those three people. But I said if you could move them, find others. Really good-looking people. So, over the course of the book, Phil Needle is having a bad day at work. He's going on a business trip, which is his fantasy of a rebellious voyage, and meanwhile his daughter, completely without his noticing, is taking a much more dire and, as it turns out, violent journey.
And the journey starts with a single transgression, which is shoplifting. She's punished for it. What happens next? What's her punishment for shoplifting?
Her punishment is that she has to spend some time volunteering in a senior center. I wanted to put other people on the pirate boat, and indeed Gwen ends up with this man Errol, who captains the pirate boat. Errol has dementia, which was, as I was thinking of people to put on the pirate ship, I wanted to put a young woman because they're angry and I have a lot of admiration for that. And then, with some of the same anger that I was hearing from young people I knew. For instance, when I would tour for the Snicket books, I was touring for the Snicket books once at the dawn of the smartphone. Remember that time? And
wasn't that long ago either.
Yeah, they were about this big. And I noticed some young women who had smartphones, and I said, "Why, you must be quite pleased to have a smartphone," I said, having watched some advertisements. And they told me they weren't pleased. This young woman said to me, "It's the first time, now whenever I call my parents, I have to be where I say I am."
Oh.
Because they can tell where I was. And that really struck me, because that's the beginning of freedom and adolescence, is to call your parents and be somewhere other than where you say you are. And then I was visiting a senior center, and I heard a man say, "I can never just go out to lunch." And it struck me as the same confinement. And so I wanted to put an older person on the boat, and I was trying to think of what would make an older person choose to be a pirate, because it's something impulsive, so maybe if you were older and wiser, you might not like that. I fell upon dementia, that the old man would be suffering from losing kind of his own mind and that form of escape, and that might encourage him to do something more rash.
So these two characters are the seed of a much bigger crew that we'll talk about soon. But first,
okay.
can you read from the book a little about this,
Sure.
this meeting point between...
Why, I seem to have a part marked here.
Nice. Earlier.
Wow, what are the chances?
So Gwen is meeting the person in the elderly folks home. His name is Errol, and he's got dementia. And
You called it elderly folks here?
elderly folks home. I don't know.
so
I just
charmed.
plucked that out of my brain.
I keep learning all the expressions. I like when you order food in Australia and they say too easy.
Too easy. It
makes me want to challenge them. You know? Like I said, all right, well then bring me 5 quail eggs. Now, is that too easy?
Too easy.
Sorry, I turned into kind of Yakov Smirnoff from Gwen, this is when Gwen just meets Errol. She is taken to see him by a man named Manny, who works at the old age home. From around a corner, Gwen could hear a loud, scraped voice saying, "Raisin! Raisin! Raisin! Raisin!" Each time like it was starting all over, and she rounded that corner, and she was led through that door, and "Raisin! Raisin! Raisin!" was what he was saying when they found each other. "Errol," Manny said. Errol looked up from his chair, which he had moved closer to the sun. Gwen could see its wake across the bad rug. He had a plastic tray across his knees like an airline passenger, and on the tray was an overturned bowl and a small mountain of cereal that he was picking through. The raisins were isolated in a line, as if they'd soon be marched off. Gwen was relieved. It was not crazy to pick out the raisins. She hoped it wasn't. "Cereal for lunch is ridiculous," he said to Manny. as if an argument were already in progress. "You're fired." "You asked for cereal," Manny said, "and I don't work for you." "For breakfast, I thought it was. Curse me." "This is Gwen, Errol." "I know who it is." "She's volunteered to be your companion." "I know who it is," Errol said again. "Leave me alone if you're not going to help." This was, to Gwen, a very perfect sentence. Just the thing she thought all the time. Manny backed out of the room and they sized each other up. The air between them felt awkward and managed, as if they were estranged instead of being strangers. Gwen felt the familiar jitter, buzzy and smiley, of being next to old people. Her mother didn't like it either, she realized. That's why she'd chosen this for Gwen's punishment. "How'd you get here?" Errol said finally. "My mom drove me." "No, I mean, which way did you take?" "We just took, Hill Street." "Hill Street? No fucking kidding." Or flipping, as it is said here. "Uh-huh." "Was swearing against the rules?" She had signed a form. "I mean, I can't believe they called it Hill Street." "Uh-huh." "It is an insult," Errol said with mild fury. "I guess I'll go my own way." "I guess so," Gwen said. "I don't know what that means." "It means, what do they teach you in school? Are you here for some kind of project?" "No, punishment." "Good. I'm glad. I don't like the school project kids. You know you're going to die when they come at you with a tape recorder." "Tell us about the Navy." "You want to know about the Navy?" "No," Gwen said. "Good. Are you here for some kind of project?" "Punishment," Gwen said again, but felt bad about it and so added, "I'm your companion," which made it worse. But Errol didn't notice or forgot that he did notice. "What'd you do?" "Stole stuff." Errol was putting a pinch of cereal in his mouth, and now he coughed long and hard at it. Gwen took a step toward him, but no more. He coughed and coughed, but Gwen did not do anything and could not think what to do. "As I live and breathe," he said. "Are you okay?" "What did you steal?" "Candy, mostly." "That's just what I steal." "Did you steal it from here?" "No, from a drugstore." "What did you steal?" "Candy, mostly." Errol stared at her for a moment and then grinned. "From where?" "The drugstore." "Did I ask you that?" "It's okay." "I have a problem with my memory." "That's okay." "It's not a big problem. I worry about it, though. What's that river?" "What river?" "The big one." "Mississippi?" "Not the Amazon. The one in Egypt." "The Nile." "That's it. Sea Nile. I made it up to remember." "I worry about it, though. I have a problem with my memory. But I used to remember everything, even when I was a kid. What did you think about that?" Gwen could not think about that. Errol, surely, had always been old. Gwen could not imagine him younger than he was. "I guess it's funny how life turns out," she tried. "Not last I checked," Errol said with a snort. "Raisin! Raisin! Want to help me?" Gwen smiled. She felt as if something, a balloon, was untied from her and flitting toward the ceiling. She took another step forward and found a raisin. "Raisin," she said. "Raisin! Raisin! Raisin!" I think maybe I'll stop there.
Thanks, Daniel.
Sure.
So, that character of Errol
Yeah.
has dementia, specifically has Alzheimer's disease. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but when you started writing We Are Pirates, you didn't have any personal insights into the disease necessarily.
I did not. I had the idea of dementia, and then I started writing the book, and I could feel it was all wrong. The cultural depictions of dementia are, atrociously shallow for the most part. And I didn't know what I was going to do about it. I thought maybe I could volunteer at some center and then hurriedly take notes, but that felt kind of skeevy. That's a word here, right? And so I put the book away for a while, which is a terrible feeling. I don't know if you've ever put a book away.
Oh, sure.
It's a bad feeling.
Yeah, feels like
You
you're
keep it in a
abandoning
drawer,
child.
but then you feel it in the drawer looking
It's like
at
you're
you.
abandoning a child by keeping it in the basement.
Yeah.
Actually, that's not abandonment, that's something different.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. As has been explained to you.
Yes. Anyway, so you
keep it in a drawer, and the desk stares at you, and so you keep the desk in a room, and then the door stares at you in the room, and then before you know it, you have a castle, and you.
And so, why did the book come back into your life?
Well, in that time, my father was diagnosed with dementia, and I suddenly was completely immersed in this. it was quite shocking, and also quite handy. And so, it was my father. It is one of the delights now that the book is done, which I finished it just as my father passed, and it is a delight actually to wander the world and speak about it because it would tickle him pink. And I spend a lot of time with him, and the kind of circular conversation and the lost and foundness of that disease was a big part of my life. It feels close. I feel close to him, having a piece of him in this book. It's nice to wander around talking about it. But it enabled me to take up the book again, which was a very curious feeling.
I imagine for some writers, if they are in that situation, having a disease like Alzheimer's come into their life so intimately, even though it was something they were writing about, would probably compel them to run in the opposite direction. But for you, it actually sounded like a comfort that you wanted to be able to explore this in literature. It had been a story that was on my mind. I mean, it was such a strange and terrible coincidence, but it had been a story that was on my mind, and then I was able to dive into it as I was there. And so I think it was a place to put something that was on my mind, that was haunting me from my life, which I think is quite common in literature. Something haunts you and then you write it down. That's kind of the history of literature, I guess. We'll think about that later. Was there something in particular when you were writing Errol, and given what you then learned about Alzheimer's, that you wanted to convey about the disease through him? The scary thing about brain diseases is that we think of the sentence "I have a brain," but it's probably closer to say "I am a brain." And a disease of the brain, changes the personality and changes who that person is. And it's a very curious and heartbreaking thing to be close to, and it is actually what we try to grasp, I think, about ourselves with consciousness. We try to grasp who we are versus, is it really just things we do or just things we think, or where does that identity come from? So I think that's an interesting question. They're not the only two characters that we encounter in this book. They're not the only two characters in this sort of...
That would be kind of dull if it
in this maybe a buddy comedy, Hit the Road.
Even though when you hit the road, there's someone on the road.
Yeah, that's true. So we collect some different ragtag crews as well. Can you lead us who becomes involved? Because I guess one of the great hallmarks of a lot of pirate literature is you assemble a crew of unlikely characters together. Similarly with your book, who have we got in the ship that we take off on with Gwen and Errol?
Gwen has at the beginning of the book, she has one of those best friends that's terrible to you. We all know what that's like. I mean women. And then she gets one of those new fierce best friends who changes your life and gets you to be very exciting. So she comes along, and they have a plan to kidnap a young man and bring him, because they're into guys. And the kidnapping doesn't go quite the way they want it to, but a young man joins them. And then Manny, who you met extremely briefly in that scene, is a Haitian immigrant who's working at the senior center. He, out of all the people in the book, is a life that's shaped by the most horrifying displacement, or the most genuine displacement, I guess you could say. And he ends up joining them too. And he is perhaps the more mysterious figure in the book. We know that he's been through something terrible, and that life of crime and fleeing and violence is not as distant from him as it is from the others, and that's interesting too. I'm interested in researching piracy. When I started this book, the whole idea of piracy was kind of a lark, and then as I read more novels and histories of piracy, piracy is really the history of displacement and desperation, of people who are not welcome where they are. There's a great history of piracy called The Wooden World, which postulates that once you step off land and onto a ship and you are able to make up your own world. There's early transgenderism and transvestism, all kinds of queerness that's going on pirate ships, and all sorts of racial displacement and things like that. It's very interesting. So it seemed even more relevant that you opened, for instance, by talking about the people who lived here before anyone else did, and I know Australia has its own history of displacement and disenfranchisement, which matches up and doesn't with America's, and those histories are all interesting to me.
So those histories that come into your radar, pirate history in particular, when does it actually arrive on your radar? Were you reading like pirate books and pirate literature when you were growing up, or was this sort of something that came into your life because you came up with this idea?
I read a little bit of it growing up. Who didn't see something with pirates or read something with pirates when they were a small child? And when I was in high school, we had to take a career test. That's how we do it in America. It was a 3-part test. The first part was a long list of careers, and you marked off the ones you were interested in. And the second part was a personality test, and they told you what you ought to be interested in. They know. And then the third part was the same list, and you had to see if you changed your mind. And by that third part, I was feeling disenfranchised. Because I was an adolescent. And so I agitated. I got everyone in my homeroom to check other, and then put pirate there. And I got in trouble. As it turned out, actually, my high school was being used as a small sample for a national test, and so the whole thing was off because they were going to have to say that 7% of American youth wanted to be pirates. And all because of the personality test. It's the worst personality test in the world. But it really stuck with me. That was kind of the first idea for the book, was back then. But it stuck with me because I thought if I'd said forest ranger or ballerina, I don't think everyone would have done it. But pirate, there was something so perfect about being a pirate. And I think the fantasy of going away from where you are, who doesn't have that fantasy? I'd like to get out of here and do something. And then also that we have this notion of pirates as being kind of glamorous and dashing, but then when we think about what they do, it's quite terrible. And I don't mean that we blame them. I just mean the life is not. You think of the wind in the sails, and then you have to think to yourself, oh right, and then they, what do they do with the other people again? They don't treat them very well. And so that's, I like that too, that when you fantasize about escaping, you don't always follow through on how that's going to go.
Sure. You're based in San Francisco nowadays.
I am.
I didn't know much about the fact that San Francisco actually has this rich pirate history. Was that something that you read into? And
yeah, well, I was reluctant at first to set the book in San Francisco because I live there, and I've set other books in San Francisco, and I thought enough. Although I'm in informal competition with a friend of mine, Andrew Sean Greer, a great writer, to write. We both want to write like a really good San Francisco novel, but I still thought no, set it someplace else. But then every pirate history that I read was leading me to San Francisco, and it was leading me literally. Sometimes I was sitting in the building that the pirate history would lead me to. It would say, and it was right here, and I would think, okay, you have to write about this because you're right here. And yeah, but it's a proud aspect of San Francisco's history. I mean, San Francisco has been a long port, and it's been a refuge and a sanctuary for people for a long time. And I like the idea that even then there were people who couldn't wait to get away. That charms me.
You mentioned that when we think of piracy, we might think of, swashbuckling adventure or comedy nowadays especially, but there's also a bloody side. I've noticed that you also said We Are Pirates is a sad story and a funny story, much in the same way that piracy is funny and sad. Where does the sadness come from in piracy?
Well, it's a lonely life. I mean, you're literally not welcome in your home, and you're on a small wooden boat with some other people. There's a history of female piracy, for instance, that's utterly fascinating, that women who felt so unwelcome in the culture that they were in disguised themselves as men for life on board a boat. Not, just to get into a club or something. Not as like a sitcom premise. And I just think that is a life of deep loneliness. How could it not be? And so it seems sad to me. And also just that it's an adventure and that it usually ends badly. The careers of pirates don't usually end with, and then they retired comfortably, with no moral compunctions or punishments. Yeah.
So it strikes me in this whole conversation that teenagers and pirates sound like they have a lot in common. Many are ruthless. We also romanticize...
Snappy dressers.
Yep, absolutely. But we also romanticize pirates in the same way... One-eyed, some of them are. But we also romanticize pirates in the same way that we romanticize youth. What came first? Because you talk about, your sister being a starting point, piracy and piracy literature being the starting point. Did they come together at the same time, or was there a eureka moment where you realised, actually, there are some parallels, or I'd like to explore them parallel to each other?
I had the idea, I guess I had this idea of, wouldn't it be interesting to write a book in which people attempted to become pirates? And then I thought, who should go on that book? And I mean, who should go on that boat? And that's when I thought of the girl and the older man. And then I just started to read about piracy. I mean, this is generally how I work. I have some idea that sounds inane, and then I read about it, and it turns out to be sad. That is also the history of the world, I think. And so I read about it, and then the book turns out to be more serious than I want. I mean, sometimes it turns out not to be a book, but I read about it, and I get immersed in it, and I get interested. And this book, in particular, was on a back burner for a while, and so I kept thinking about it when I wasn't thinking about other things. And yeah, that's just kind of my method.
What's interesting about this book is that it involves teenagers, teenage protagonists, but it's not really necessarily a book for teenagers. And I'm interested in this sort of divide because, of course, a lot of people in this room know you first and foremost for your Lemony Snicket works. You're also writing these books for adults, and this has quite gory scenes in it as well that probably, you know, would frighten younger readers. Do a lot of people come to your works thinking that you're still Lemony Snicket and inadvertently read something like this? And does that bother you?
I like the idea of inadvertently reading something. Whoa! My eyes fell out on the screen. Yeah. Well, I certainly don't know who comes to my work and why and their life history. I never quite understand the divisions between literature when we talk about who reads it. I think of children's literature as a genre. It's like a mystery or a science fiction. It has some rules about it. It has some traditions that you can uphold or you can tweak. But it doesn't. I don't think of the division as to who is reading it. I mean, I've written some picture books, for instance, and I always think it's interesting that people say, oh, it's only little kids who read picture books. Well, no, it isn't. Actually, it's parents. Little kids can't read. So you're really writing a book for adults to read out loud to someone else, which is a whole interesting way to go about it. And, I mean, when you say there are gory parts that would put young people off, all I think of is that it seems half the movies that are being advertised are the stories of teenagers being disemboweled, and that is for other teenagers to watch.
And I guess one of the joys...
Right? They don't say when you're adult, surely you want to see Slumber Party Massacre. It's when you go to a slumber party you want to see Slumber Party Massacre. So I think that the age of when you're ready to read any certain book, you can't really find out until you read it. And people have said to me before with this book, well, with every book I've written, they'll say, oh, aren't you scared that little children will pick it up and read it? And I always think, and what's the end of that story again? Become murderers? Is that the fear? You might read this book and become frightened, sorry. Then you could turn the light on or
and I guess
do whatever you do when you become frightened.
One of the joys for me, at least as a teenager, was reading stuff that wasn't quite age appropriate in retrospect. Were you that kind of reader as well, or what sort of age inappropriate stuff were you reading when you were young?
Well, it's funny you should ask. I was recently my what's the word I'm looking for? Mother. You have one of those. Yeah, you have a famous mom.
She's here right now.
Oh.
Yeah. Hi, Mum.
Oh, hi. We'll talk later. My mother's often in the front row. We'll talk later.
Yeah.
We have so much to talk about off stage. But she was cleaning out her house, and she gave me some books that were my favorite books, basically from about age 17 to about age 22. And she said, oh, look, these were on your shelf, take them. And so I took them and I reread them. And I was a quite pretentious teenager. I'm sure that will stun you. And so I had a gang, more or less chronicled in the Basic Age, my first novel, and we all read a lot of highfalutin literature, and so this was a lot of highfalutin literature, but I reread it, and it was all filthy, which fascinated me. Lawrence Durrell, Milan Kundera, Nabokov, The Mamo Kings Play Songs of Love by Oscar Welos. What else am I thinking of? Rachel Ingalls, Paul Auster, all these books that I remembered them, and I wasn't like that I was reading them with breathless erotic fixation, but that interested me, and and so it was inappropriate in a way.
Yeah.
But no one thought it was inappropriate because it looked like highfalutin literature. You know,
Absolutely.
The Mambo Kings Play Songs of Love is a beautiful novel. It won the Pulitzer Prize in the United States. It's the story of a generation of human immigrants and about the kind of exploitation of ethnicity by popular culture, and it's a beautiful lost romance and things like that. It's also full of oral sex. So everybody was happy. You know, people would look at me and say, "Oh, look, he's winning a book that just won the Pulitzer," and I would say, "Uh-huh."
Yeah.
That's the part I like.
So there was
The Pulitzer part.
So there was a filthy streak in what you were reading. Was there a macabre streak in what you were reading as well? I guess when we think
Well, it's
of...
kind of the same thing. I like, well, particularly when I was a young child, I really liked books where terrible things happen. That was my idea of a good time. I mean, Roald Dahl, I think, is kind of the king of capturing that kind of wickedness in children's literature. It's very satisfying. If you meet a villain in a Roald Dahl book, you know they're not, at the end, they're not going to say, "Gosh, I've seen the error of my ways and I'll be kind from now on." That's not what is going to happen. And it's delicious. And then there wasn't, by the time I was in maybe 5th or 6th grade, I was starting to read Agatha Christie, which is full of murder. That's fun too. You know, they were kind of real novels, but then at the same time, someone's being killed. Blackmail, I didn't really understand what blackmail was for a few years, and that's why I had to go over it with my parents, which was a lot of fun.
Actually, you're providing us with a very good reading list. Good homework, everyone.
Oh, you're welcome, Melbourne.
Now, you know, as a reader of this book who's non-white, I thought there were some really fantastically sketched out moments of American race relations in the book as well. And there's this great sentence in there that I, just bent the page at it, where you write as the narrator, just about everyone else, by the way, in this book is white. And I thought it was just this sort of delicious dropping in of a moment. Why did you want to include that sentence? And can you tell us more about the other sort of racial politics in the book?
Well, I think, certainly the history of race in America is one of almost constant displacement and disenfranchisement and violence and white anxiety, which I'm sure has no equal in Australia, but imagine if it did. And so Manny in particular is the Haitian character. He is, his name isn't Manny. For instance, he's just called Manny at the senior center because it's easier to pronounce than his actual name. He's misidentified as being from Jamaica, and then the staff doesn't really
believe him.
Well, doesn't care one way or the other. Okay, Jamaica. And it's, that's something that one sees, I think, throughout American culture. I can't believe that it would be foreign from Australia, and I wanted to put some of that in there because I don't think you can, first of all, I don't think you can take on American culture and not take on race, and I also think that you can't talk about displacement and disenfranchisement without talking, that would be the tallest poppy, is that the expression? That would be the one of the most obvious signs.
I want to throw it to the audience soon, and there will be roaming mics coming around, so if you've got a question, put your hand in a sec. But before I throw it to the audience, I want to know what's happening next for you, because you seem to be a remarkably ambidextrous writer in terms of what projects you choose running for alias.
If you can see my left-handed handwriting.
How do you decide on a project? Do you have sort of prerequisites in terms of what you're going to work on next?
No. I'm not impulsive, I would say, but I have a lot of ideas, and so when I'm done with one of them, then I look at my ideas and then write one of them, or another one that seems suddenly better.
So it's hunches, really?
Yeah, well, it's just letting things simmer, I guess, and thinking about them, and then particularly when I'm finishing a book and then there's kind of edits and things like that, that's the time when I begin to get really hungry to write something else, so I try to listen to that voice too. I wrote a lot this year. I wrote, one thing that was also powerful was the fact that I put away We Are Pirates for a long time, turned out to be great. And I'd met all these writers before who had said to me that, oh, when I finish a book, I put it away for a year before I look at it again. And I thought, you do not, you're lying. And then I put this away by virtue of not understanding dementia, and when I came back to it, it was really quite beautiful to put it away and come back to it. So I wrote a lot this year that I'm putting it away. Netflix is adapting a series of unfortunate events, and so I'm
We've got Netflix here now as well. We can actually watch that.
Oh yeah, that's right. We finally conquered you.
Yeah.
And so I'm beginning to work on the scripts and production for that this fall, and so I hope that meanwhile these books will be simmering away, and then when I look at them again, they will be beautiful and not ugly, which is how I feel about them now.
How exciting. Busy man. Let's take some audience
Beats
questions. Raise up your hand. Let's start in the middle there, and why don't we go to the person with the amazing headwear, and then the person 2 seats up.
The person who isn't wearing it.
Why did you use Lemony Snicket as the author's name for the series of Unfortunate Events books?
Why did I use the name Lemony Snicket for the author's name?
Do you remember where it came from? Did you
I
just
do.
Sort of...
I was there. I was on the phone with a right-wing organization because I wanted them to mail me some materials so that I would make fun of them in a novel. And I didn't want to be on the mailing list of such an organization for obvious reasons. So I was on the phone with this very dim-witted woman, and she said, give me your name so we may send you the materials. I'm making this gesture so everyone knows the phone. And I thought, quick, don't give your real name. So I thought, say something else. Say just not something that isn't your name. And I said, Lemony Snicket. And then there was a pause. And during the pause, I thought, that was a terrible mistake. Out of all the things you could have said. And then she said, is that spelled how it sounds? And I said, yes. And I said, read it back to me, because I had no idea how it sounded. And then I had this name lying around. And I would use it. I had a hobby at the time, which was to take the world's most harmless article in the world's most harmless newspaper and then write the editor a raging letter and why would I want to sign those with my own name? That's madness. So I would sign them Lemony Snicket. Some friends for my birthday gave me some business cards that said Lemony Snicket, and I would use them at bars. I would introduce myself. For a while, I said I was a yacht lawyer. That's something that I heard somebody say, and I didn't know what that was. And so I would say I represent the yacht itself. Instead of the owner or the Coast Guard, I represent the interest of the yacht. But someone finally said that's not. You can't be that because that's not real. So I began to say I was in rhetoric, which sounds okay. So then years later, I got interested in terrible things happening to children, as maybe you are. And I thought, well, the name of the narrator who is interested in the Baudelaires and who is weepy over Beatrice, I have this name left over. I'll just use that. And then I thought it would be interesting to publish the books under the name of the narrator, because I think the narrator is interesting, and I think I'm less interesting. So maybe if I had a great thing on my head like that, it looks like it's ears and part of the scalp of an animal.
Cat.
It's a cat.
Yeah. You killed a cat to keep warm.
Do what you have to do in Melbourne.
Yeah, all right.
Thank you so much for your question. That was a great response as well. We'll pass it
Thank you.
to across.
He did.
Mr. Law's doing a great job, I think.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind. It's going to be very easy. What's your question?
Wow, your mother did not applaud there.
She really does. She really does.
With strong affection. That's how I parent.
I thought it was great that you mentioned Paul Auster, that you read him, who also plays with narrators.
He does.
And I was just interested in whether or not you're interested in postmodernism, and if you think it's important to play with the form and the preconceived structure of things.
I think it's fun to play around with form. I'm always suspicious when such things are labeled as postmodern, because if you go back and read the earliest of texts you can find, those are exactly the tricks that are being employed. If you read Gilgamesh, that's what they're doing. So either it wasn't invented in postmodernism, or the postmodern era is really long and we've never had anything else. And there's a ambiguous narrator in We Are Pirates, for instance, that's basically nicked from a lot of 19th century fiction has that sort of narrator. The first chapter of Madame Bovary, people often forget, is in first person plural. We were sitting in a classroom and Charles Bovary walked in. You never find out why that's we. Jeffrey Eugenides took that for virgin suicide. Well done. I'm interested in those kind of things. I'm not sure they're postmodern, but I like them. I think it's, you know, when someone tells you a story, the story, even if it isn't actually about them, is kind of about them because they're telling it to you, and I think that literature feels that way to me too.
Thank you for your question. Another question from the audience. We've got one there. So we can pass
Roaming mics.
one mic backwards. It's whoever gets the mic first. Question. So it's a race. It's a race. Everyone plays their bets.
It's not a bad band name, Roaming Mics.
Thanks.
Okay, one from you.
Hi. I was just wondering, will you be returning to the Lemony Snicket series every 10 years or so, or is this the final book coming out later next month?
The final book is being released, I was going to say this fall, but it's only this fall, you know, on the other part of the world. It's the last volume in All the Wrong Questions, which is associated with a series of unfortunate events, sort of. I anticipate that there'll be more from Lemony Snicket, but I'm always nervous about promising that because, you know, tomorrow could be the day that the alligators finally attack me, and I would have promised to do something. We'll see. Yeah, I don't know.
Can you tell us
Every 10 years? I'm trying to think. So I only get to write 5 more times. What am I doing here?
Can you tell us more about the Netflix adaptation, or what the format's going to be when it arrives on Netflix? What are we going to see?
At the rate we're going, I feel when it arrives on Netflix, the world will be an entirely different place. Our great-grandchildren will be watching it. It will be a show on Netflix. Yeah, I don't know what it is. I'm interested, postmodernly perhaps, in playing a little bit with the conventions of television, and we'll see how that shakes out. I haven't been fired yet, but there's still time. And I think one of the things that Netflix did that was so interesting was they got everyone to admit that that's how they were watching TV. They were watching huge binges of it. Remember when binge used to be a negative word? Now it's, why not binge? And so I'd like to see what else, how another way we might do that. We'll see.
Fantastic. Question over here.
So you spoke about your white anxiety, if you like, that exists within a society. Do you think it's perhaps, or I'm trying to articulate this question, do you think there is a certain white anxiety that you yourself possess that compels you to tell the stories of oppressed peoples to which you might necessarily belong, and how do you deal with that, of telling the story that you yourself are not necessarily directly connected with?
Do you live with white guilt, Dave?
Sure, who doesn't? I mean, I certainly, and, you know, made a famous misstep last fall with it. But I don't think I could be part of the culture of the United States and be a white man and not be part of the culture of the United States and a white man. And I think that if you're writing a work that is meant to be realistic about other cultures and the culture is not your own, you better do your work, is what I think. And I also think that certainly the majority of fiction that is published in the States is from the States, and then within the States are way more white voices than other voices, and which is to American publishing's shame, for sure, not only to encourage more voices within the United States borders, but also to look at all the glorious fiction and translation that comes through at such a tiny trickle into America in particular. But I think that should go on while people are exploring other cultures as well. And I think oftentimes it turns into an either-or conversation, which is, how do we feel about someone who isn't Korean writing about Korea, and then shouldn't we have more Korean people writing about Korea instead? And then I think, well, the shelves should be bulging with everybody thinking everything.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask a slightly strange question, but do you see whiteness? I've got a theory about white guilt that manifests in two ways. One is people who say that I don't see race at all, and then there are other people who are very, very aware of their whiteness and therefore do see when it's an all-white cast on TV, when it's an all-white crew on a pirate ship in a novel or something like that.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think I'm aware of. That's something that I'm aware of. I think and I'm lucky enough to live in a city where there's so many voices who are articulating these sort of issues that it would be hard not to, I think, to know it. So I think that's interesting. The vanilla myth is something that is talked about in the States a little bit, which is the...
What is that?
It's the idea that, when you think of, say, plain ice cream, you think of vanilla, but vanilla isn't plain, it's a flavor. And that white is not just what people are, and then there's some other people doing other things. It's a distinct. There's no such thing as a plain person. There's no such thing as a person without race, and that both biological and sociological constructions are colliding when we think about race, but that no one is exempt from it, and its attendant anxieties.
And you're very exotic to me. So do we have another question here?
So offensive.
Do we have a mic that can come down?
I think we have a...
Oh, well, I've got one question
we have a
there, and
winner
I'll
there.
get another mic to you. Yes, question here.
Hello.
Hello.
Going back to Netflix.
Yeah.
What's it like?
Netflix and race, the two American...
What's it like adapting your own work and adapting it for another medium and writing in a different medium?
Well, what's interesting about film, and I'll just use film to talk about Netflix as well, because they say it's television, but no one's watching on television now, is that it's just incredibly collaborative. Everyone's working. Hundreds and hundreds of people will be working on the Netflix thing. And that's very different from what I'm used to. I'm used to sitting in a room by myself. And if I say, you know what, let's just try it with them on top of a waterfall, and then I try that for a while, that's very cheap to do on paper. If they said, let's just shoot a few episodes on the top of the waterfall and we'll just see how it turns out, that's not what you can do. And so there were a bunch of people in the room and we're all arguing. It's another situation where you want a bunch of different voices from a bunch of different perspectives in a room, and it's another situation in America corporate media that it's largely white people who are designing shows, so it's a whole other conversation that is...
Intersection of Netflix and race.
There we go. It's the American state. And so you want an interesting room full of people thinking of interesting things. And probably eventually I will be fired, which is fine. But it's interesting, but I try to figure out what about the story I think would be interesting to put on screen rather than making sure that everyone's being fanatically loyal to something. And it's a challenge, and it's a challenge between wanting people who are good at their jobs to do their jobs and not entirely wanting to let go of them. So it's an ongoing challenge. But, I've had real jobs and I've done this, and this is better.
So a question there, and one behind, and maybe we could go you, and then you. We'll pass the mic down.
Cool. Musical mics.
Yes.
Are there any fundamental differences between when you sit down to write as Lemony Snicket and when you sit down to write as Daniel Handler? Is there something specific you do to sort of move into that different persona, or would
Do I
you
wear
say
a cape?
Different hat.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Daniel's not here! Well, I guess in some ways, yes, because because of the specific kind of things that I'm writing. There isn't a Lemony Snicket book for adults. It's all in the realm of children's literature, and I think those have specific traditions that I like to think about. But just in terms of the mindset, no, there isn't. I'm just doing sentences over and over on legal pads looking like a crazy person. I might look less crazy if I were wearing a cape, come to think of it. They would just say, well, now he's wearing a cape, we'll let him do anything.
I really enjoyed the book, by the way. I just
thank you.
And I just was wondering why you decided to make the narrator a stranger and essentially almost an outlaw to the story itself.
Well, as I read pirate novels, and there's kind of a 19th century glory period of them. And a lot of adventure novels of that sort have exactly that sign of strange narrator. They say, I was walking down the street and I met a man and he told me a story, and then the whole novel is the story that he told, right? Heart of Darkness, people are sitting around and they're like, this reminds me of something, and that's the whole book. And I always thought that was a curious tradition, and I think it puts you off at this unsteadiness of, what am I hearing? Am I hearing something that's true? Am I hearing something that isn't? Is the story about this, or is it about this? You know, is The Wizard of Oz the story of a girl who hits her head and falls down? Is that the whole story? Or does she go someplace? And I'm interested in those questions, and I just thought it would be interesting to have a narrator open up, and I think it feels slightly snickety, which charms me. Because sometimes people say, it's literally, they will say, it's as if the books were written by the same person, and then I have to say, well...
Thank you very much. Any more questions? Was there one there? It's coming round. And we'll take off.
We Are Pirates doesn't necessarily sound like an adult book. It kind of appeals to children. So what led you to write an adult book called We Are Pirates about, you know, a 14-year-old girl becoming a pirate?
What led me... Well, I mean, yeah. It's... Adult book always sounds dirty, first of all. We'll say that. I'm trying to think of what it's called. There was a bookstore I just walked by a couple days ago right in this neighborhood, and I couldn't figure out if it meant it was pornographic or just strange. Liberation? Is that what I mean? Liberation books?
Hill of Content?
Liberated books,
Liberated
right?
books.
And I thought, like, oh, is it like leftist propaganda, or is it just filth? And are they different? I mean, I think that We Are Pirates is not a work of children's literature. It's not like The Wind in the Willows. It doesn't conform to certain traditions of that, and so therefore I think it's what we call in the States literary fiction, which is a catch-all term for all the rest of the literature that doesn't conform to a specific genre and doesn't sell. So I just think that's where it belongs. It's true that We Are Pirates isn't the most maybe elderly title one has ever heard of, but it's a phrase that is used several times in the novel in different contexts, and then it also speaks, I think, of all of us. I think if you're conscious in this world, from wherever your culture or guilt might take you, but I think that if you're conscious and thinking about the world, you can't help but feel displaced. You can't help but feel that you want to escape, that all of us are together in this culture in which we see horror and despair. And that who wants ownership of that? Everyone feels displaced from that, and everyone longs to escape it. That's what I think.
Thanks for your question. We've got time for one more question before we wrap up. Just there.
All right, so you're the last question, so you have to sum up the entire afternoon in such a way that's powerful and philosophical and makes a large statement for the Melbourne Writers Festival. Go!
So when I read A Series of Unfortunate Events, I know they're all kind of there, but one of my favourite things about when I was reading them was that it didn't seem like you were talking down to children, and while I've read other books by you and it's obviously very different, were you conscious of the fact that you weren't trying to talk down to children, because often children's books do?
Yeah, a lot of children's books do. We should also say that a lot of adult literature talks down to adults. So I think there's generally a problem of scorn for others in the world. And I think one thing is that I didn't know anything about children when I started. I didn't have any, and I knew few socially. It was at a time in my life, I was in my 20s, where I just didn't know a lot of children. I know more now, and I have one. I mean, sounds like I bought him or something. When a man and a woman love each other very much. And I don't like condescension, and so I think we should try to talk to each other as maturely as possible. I also think that talking with children tends to be a really great conversation. I'm often accused of, oh, you must be young at heart, or a child inside, or you never grew up. And I think of this party once where I went, oh, terrible party, and I got there and all the adults were talking about, traffic and real estate. And so, I made a gin gimlet and I just went through the room thinking, where are anyone I would like to speak to? And I ended up in the backyard and there were some children there playing, and so I just sat on the stairs, exhausted by this party, and I said to a child, so what's going on? And he said, I dreamed I was a horse. And it was such a great conversation. And it's not the age, right? It's not, I would rather talk with children. If an adult had said to me, I dreamed I was a horse, I would say, we are talking all night. And in many ways, the conversation we had was kind of blocked by he was a child, because I would have to say it's a gimlet, you can't have any, and it's complicated. Then I would tell him a story, and suddenly I realized the story, I was like, oh, now I have to explain something to you that I'm going to be caught explaining to you about adultery. But I think that often, if you're a child, you haven't been taught yet to condescend in that particular way. Children instinctively know how to be nasty in a million ways, but you haven't been taught to dumb down your language and pretend a narrative is present that is not the way of the world. And so I like literature that is upfront about the way of the world, and I'm grateful to come to a room and talk about it. Thank you very much.
All the time we have for today, but the conversation doesn't need to end here, because the conversation can continue when you buy copies of the book to get Daniel Handler to sign them at the autograph desk.
But I'll only talk to people
basically
purchase them.
Benjamin Law, thanks for coming to the Melbourne Writers Festival. Could we just have one
Give it up for Mr. Law.